But yeah, to get started, we're really happy to present this book. This is kind of our Helena book launch for this thing. And several years ago, Doug approached the Montana Historical Society Press about publishing this project, in which he aimed to really present the settlement archaeology and history of Montana in a really accessible, public-facing format. It reads really well, it flows wonderfully. And so the result is we have this beautiful and really fascinating book. It draws on DNA analysis, archaeological excavation, and the work of a number of other archaeologists and experts. And it stretches all the way from Siberia, Australasia, through Beringia, and into North America, and through Alaska, and finally down into Montana. So the author, Doug MacDonald, he's a professor in the Anthropology Department at the University of Montana. His research focuses on the Native American archaeology of Montana, Wyoming, and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And he's particularly interested in the earliest migrations of Native Americans to North America. So much so that he wrote this book and we published it, and he also has written a couple other books about similar topics. And his prior books are Before History and Before Yellowstone, Native American Archaeology in the National Park. And his Yellowstone Archaeology project has led to more than 20 graduate student projects and 30 articles or book chapters. So without further ado, and not having to hear from me anymore, I'm going to leave you with Doug. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Helena for this talk. I appreciate you turning out on not a very cold Thursday night, is it? It's like the calm before the storm, because I got to drive back to Missoula tonight, and I'm thinking it's going to be nasty, right? Yeah, you're nodding. It's going to be snowy, and maybe we'll get some more snow. You don't like the snow? No. So this talk is called Land of Beginnings. This is the title of the book that just came out, published by the Montana Historical Society Press, and I really appreciate the work that the Montana Historical Society Press did. Diana DiStefano, who was the editor at the time that the book was being put together 3 or 4 years ago. That's how long these take to get out. It literally did start 3 or 4 years ago. And since that time, Cody Ewert was a big participant on the book, and apparently he's undergoing some surgery, but I wanted to thank him for his efforts on the book as well. And it's nice to see it out in print. And just so you know, I don't get a penny of revenue from this. It is all the proceeds go to Montana Historical Society. It was one of the things in the book contract. And so don't think I'm making bank on this book or anything like that. But I love to write. I love to publish these things about Montana history. And let's see where we go from here. So this is a prequel. The book, Land of Beginnings, I consider it to be a prequel to a book that had previously been published in 2012. And so Montana Before History was published in 2012. That covered basically the time period from about the Anzac site, like 11,000 years ago, up to about the time of Lewis and Clark, a couple 230 years ago or so. But it didn't do a very good job, and there was only maybe a page or two that dealt with what came before, where Native Americans originated from. But yet I taught a lot of that stuff in my classes, so I wanted to have another book that led from Asia, Siberia, through Beringia, down the Pacific coast, through the interior to Montana. There's a lot of books like this in other states that do similar things, but none of them had ever focused just on Montana. So I wanted to do that. So this is Land of Beginnings is a prequel to Montana Before History. So read Land of Beginnings first, and then Montana Before History. So the way this talk is going to work is I'm going to go through basically the way the book is structured, talk very briefly about a couple segments regarding ethnographic histories, ethno-histories, Native American histories, about origins. Then I'll talk a little bit about the importance of the DNA research that's been done at the Anzac site. Then talk about several of the most important, very early archaeological sites in the western United States, mostly the West Coast and the American Southwest, that tell us when first peoples arrived. Then I'll talk about Montana. And so we'll talk maybe 15, 20 minutes about how Native Americans got to Montana, and then we'll talk about Montana. Now I know one of the biggest criticisms I'm going to get about this book is that I only talk about 2 archaeological sites that are in Montana. And part of that is because we don't have a ton of very early sites here. The Lindsay Mammoth site is one that I'll talk about. Whether or not it's an archaeological site's the big question. And then the Anzac site, which all of you, I'm sure, know a lot about the Anzac site, but I will talk about it because for now, it's the oldest site that we have, unless you consider Lindsay to be a legitimate human-made site. After, I'll talk a little bit about some important Clovis sites that are about the same time as Anzac and give you some more information on those, and just give you an idea about Clovis culture, those first peoples of Montana. But really focusing on the Anzac site and the results that were there. And then at the very end, talk about where we might be able to look for earlier sites, because it is theoretically possible that there are earlier sites, older than the Anzac site, perhaps even older than the Lindsay Mammoth. And so I haven't found them. You guys are probably the people who are going to find them. All these important sites. Lindsay Mammoth was found by a rancher. The Anzac site were found by people digging gravel for a parking lot in Wilsaw. So these sites are found by people like you, very rarely by professionals like me. And so when you do find those sites, who are you going to call, though? Hopefully me. I want to take all the credit. No, I'm just kidding. So where can we look for these sites? And maybe you even have some of those sites on your own property. And so one of the things that anthropologists try to do is, especially those of us that study Native American history, is work with tribes. And so I've always thought that there's quite a bit of synergy between Native American histories, oral histories, and archaeology. One of the stories that is in the book talks about the Blackfeet and origins, and the way I like to look at them is talking about where the directionality might point us in terms of where those first peoples came from. Do those oral histories give us insight into where people originated from? The Blackfoot stories talk about coming from the north, across an ocean, across ice. We know that the Blackfeet did migrate, based on archaeological and other ethnohistories, from the Midwest, say 3,000 years ago into Montana and southern Canada. But before that, at least their stories talk about some connections to oceans and across ice, which of course is when we're talking about the first peoples. As you'll learn in today's lecture, if you don't know already, we know that they traveled from the north and from oceans and across ice. And the Salish. And so the Salish origin stories look more toward the west and talking about Pacific coast connections. And if you know anything about Salish peoples of western Montana, they live in the Columbia Plateau. Their cultural connections are much more similar to groups in the Pacific Northwest, many Salish-speaking cultures in the Pacific Northwest. So it would make sense, maybe, that these two Native American cultures of Montana had maybe an interior origin for the Blackfeet and a Pacific coastal origin for the Salish. So we can't necessarily think that all tribes came from the same direction. And one of the big outcomes of this book and my research and all the archaeologists in this room research and other researchers out there in the world is that we're not exactly which route Native Americans took first to get to Montana. Was it a Pacific Coast route or an interior route through down the Rocky Mountain front? And there was even controversy back maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago that it might not even be an Asian origin. The Solutrean connection was proposed by people like Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley that potentially linked Solutreans of Europe to Native American peoples. You've probably all seen those on the History Channel and those sorts of things. And that's kind of where those theories stand now. There's not a lot of archaeological validity to that connection these days. Just isn't that connection. But the Anzac site was the site that put the nail in the coffin for that European Solutrean connection, because the Anzac site is the only Native American burial of the Clovis culture anywhere in the entire North American continent. It's the oldest skeleton. It's in Montana. It's in Wilsaw, just north of the town of Livingston, dates to 11,000 years old. And so Eski Willerslev asked to do DNA research of those skeletal remains of this 2-year-old boy, 11,000-year-old 2-year-old boy that was found in Wilsaw, Montana. I'll talk a lot about that site a little later, but for now, the DNA study, the genetic study by Eski Willerslev proved without a doubt that those ancestors of that boy came from Northeast Asia, that all their cultural connections were Northeast Asian, and that that boy, well, not that boy obviously, but his family were the ancestors of all Native American groups in North and South America after that point. So a hugely important archaeological site right here in Montana. And so when the new Montana Historical Society building is going to be up and running up there, they are going to have a wonderful display about the Anzac site, much like they did back in the old museum. I used to love to go visit that collection of artifacts. Apparently those artifacts are not going to be on display in the new museum, and that's out of respect of the fact that they're associated with the burial of that 2-year-old boy. I'm disappointed about that, and I know a lot of us are, but it is, you know, imagine your 11,000-year-old relative's belongings on display for everybody to see. So it's a respectful thing to tribes. So that's why the Anzac site's so important, because it proves what most archaeologists, if not almost all archaeologists, thought of Native American origins were pointed to Asia. Once the archaeology had told us that, and now this really important skeleton from the Anzac site has told us that, how exactly did people get to Montana? We know they came from Northeast Asia. There's genetic links to archaeological sites in Beringia, which was that supercontinent 11,000 years ago that linked Siberia, Russia, and Alaska. There was a land mass. Did they follow the coast along there from, say, northeastern Japan, along Kamchatka and Russia, or did they take the interior route, hunting mammoths and horses and camels and things that lived up there, and then following those animals through the interior down an ice-free corridor into Montana? And the timing of it's really important, because it looks like about 12,000 years ago is when that glacial masses disconnected. The Pacific Coast glacial mass and the inland Laurentide ice mass started to melt apart. And that was open for human travel about 12,000 years ago. So when we look at sites like Lindsay Mammoth, which is dated to 12,000 years ago, that might give us huge insight into whether the inland corridor route was used or the Pacific Coast route was used, or some combination of both. And so this map shows you where we are in relation to the ice-free or inland route through the interior, starting in Northeast Asia, through Beringia, through Alaska, down that ice-free corridor. Looks like now the data are saying that that only could have happened after 12,000 years ago. That started to open. So you do the math. If the Lindsay Mammoth site is 12,000 years ago, what does that tell us about the origins of the first peoples to Montana? They had to have come down the Pacific Coast, right? And I'll talk about some of the sites that maybe point in that direction. And now I'm not saying that's right, because I'm not sure I really believe the Lindsay Mammoth site is a human-made site. So I'm not sure we know the answer to that question. So you're going to read Land of Beginnings and come away really disappointed, because that's what I say in the book too. I don't know the answer, and I know when I say this to my students, they're pretty excited about that because it gives them something to shoot for. I'm not sure. I didn't think when I was in grad school in the 90s, I thought we would know that answer. But I really don't think we do know that answer for sure. But I'll talk about what I think and maybe where the data are pointing us. So, oldest sites in the Americas, coming down from Beringia. I'm going to talk about the Manus Mastodon site. I'm going to talk about the Paisley Cave site, Cooper's Ferry, obviously the Lindsay Mammoth and Anzac. Then there's a site down in New Mexico called White Sands. and Buttermilk Creek. So those are kind of the biggest sites these days that all archaeologists are in agreement on, for the most part, that they're really old. And they come before Anzac. So Anzac site's about 11,000 years old. All of these sites predate that and are at least older than 12,000 years ago. So they're almost 1,000 years, if not more, older than Anzac. So if you look at where they're located, it also gives you some insight into where the original first Americans probably traveled from and how they got to North America. Based on the locations of these sites that are all older than 12,000 years old, probably down the Pacific coast, right? And I say probably because we only have probably 0.01% of all sites that we could find. So there's a lot more information out there to find for all of us to find in the future. But for now, based on the research we know to date, all those early sites are pointing to an earliest migration because it's before the ice-free corridor opening. All of them are older than 12,000 years ago down the Pacific coast. But does that mean that those are the first people that got to Montana? The importance of and the distinction between the Lindsay site at 12,000, and if you accept that as the earliest site, or if you accept the Anzac site at 11,000, is huge, because it'll point us in the direction of that first migration. So the Manus Mastodon, this is a site I heard about for years from Carl Gustafson. He worked at this site out of Washington State University. He was a professor of mine back in grad school in the 90s when I was over there in Pullman at Washington State. And nobody ever would believe him that this was a legitimate pre-Clovis site. It took years and years and other people to then analyze the Manus Mastodon and to discover a bone projectile point in the back of the mammoth that showed that people had killed that animal. So this is clearly a legitimate pre-Clovis site, 12,000 or so years old, of a mastodon that was killed in Washington State. Another site, very similar, Paisley Caves. Dennis Jenkins out of the University of Oregon worked at this site for many years and still goes back, was kind enough to give us photos for this book. And that site has human feces or poop that dates to about 12,300 years ago, and that was shown by DNA to be made by people in this cave called Paisley Cave. So here we have two sites. They're fairly close to the Pacific coast, right around 12,000 or 12,300 years old. Manus at 12,000, Paisley Caves at 12,300. And then if you come into the interior, this is the closest site to Montana that's pretty old. This is looking like it's at least 13,000 years old, if not older, up on the high parts of the Salmon River in Idaho, kind of south of Lewis and Clarkston there. If you go over Lolo Pass and head down toward the Salmon River from there, it's not too much of a drive from Helena here. Maybe take you 6 hours. So if you're walking like the hunter-gatherers, would take you a little longer than that. But this is a site that has what are called stemmed points. So they don't really look anything like Clovis points, but they're dating to about 13,000 years old. So they're 2,000 years older than Clovis. And they're in the interior, so that tells us there's probably even earlier sites over toward the Pacific coast. But if you're coming down the Pacific coast and then coming up the Columbia and then heading off on the tributaries of the Snake, you're going to make it up to the Salmon and get to this point. And so there's every reason to believe that this also kind of points, at least in my mind, to the Pacific coast. This one is a cool site. I was just visited the Buttermilk Creek sites and the Galt site, another very close site to this in Texas. These are dating to older than 12,000 years old. So we have sites in Texas now that are older than 12,000. They have both Clovis and pre-Clovis occupations. Now this is the site that's thrown everybody for a loop because it's dated to about 23,000 years ago. And the original dates at this site were of footprints in White Sands, New Mexico, of human footprints associated with all kinds of late Pleistocene animals that were around that vicinity that they were hunting and gathering and walking in this kind of marshy wetland at the same time, leaving footprints behind. They dated seeds in those footprints to 23,000 years ago. Those are very controversial, not widely accepted to this point. I'd say this is the most dubious of the sites, but they've reanalyzed pollen collected. People were skeptical of the seeds dates because they're water plants, and there was something called a reservoir effect that challenged the dates, blah, 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 fancy archaeology stuff. There's some archaeologists that buy it, some that don't. This group of archaeologists at the White Sands took millions of pollen grains and radiocarbon dated those millions of pollen grains and came up with similar dates right around 22,000 years ago. They also did optically stimulated luminescence dating of quartz grains in the sand, which told them, I wasn't involved in it, told them when those quartz grains were last exposed to sunlight, believe it or not, and they also looked like 21 to 22 or so thousand years ago. So if the archaeological community buys that these white sand footprints are real, it pushes back the antiquity of Native Americans in Western North America almost 10,000 years older than what we had previously thought. So all these new sites, all the time, new old sites that are kind of rewriting the book. So what are the implications of this for Montana? Well, obviously if the oldest sites are toward the Pacific coast, it speaks to a Pacific coast origin. And if we accept the sites that we talk about, like Lindsay, as being about 12,000 years old, then that probably would point to a Pacific coast origin. I'm going to give you pros and cons about the Lindsay site. Then I'll talk about the Anzac site. If you accept that the Anzac site is the oldest site in Montana at 11,000 years old, then I'm not sure we have the answer of where those first people came from, because remember that ice-free corridor opened after 12,000. That gave people plenty of time to walk down the ice-free corridor to get to Montana at that time. So what does that's what this slide is talking about. What does the archaeology tell us so far? Was Clovis first in Montana? And I would have to say, I probably think it was, even though we have all these other sites that I just talked about that are older than Clovis. We don't have that foolproof, 100% guaranteed site like Paisley Caves, like the Manus Mastodon, like Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, like Buttermilk in Texas. I would say that the Lindsay Mammoth is even less certain to be human-related than the White Sands site. So that points us toward the Anzac, just giving you a heads up. So Lindsay Mammoth, excavated in 1966, 1967 by Les Davis out of Montana State University. They did a wonderful job. The Montana Magazine of Western History had an excerpt from the book, multiple sections from the book just about Lindsay put together for that article, beautifully laid out. So if you want to just read about the highlights from the Lindsay site, that article in the Montana Magazine. If you're a Montana Historical Society member, you can get that mailed to you for free. I certainly think most of you in this room probably are. Now the controversy about this isn't that we have a 12,000-year-old mammoth. We do. We have a Columbian mammoth that dates to 12,000 years old, and it's over by Glendive, Montana. So this is over in eastern Montana. Its location, if you think about the High Line, the glaciers were probably within a few miles of this location. So mammoths were walking around, camels, horses, saber-toothed cats, all kinds of cool animals were roaming the landscape at this time. And so the big question about the Lindsay Mammoth isn't its age. I think everybody assumes and accepts Les Davis's data that it's a 12,000-year-old site. The big question is whether humans killed that or butchered that animal, proving the association of people with it. Because there's a lot of dead animals out there that people had nothing, that didn't kill, people didn't kill. This might be one of them. I know Les Davis was a huge proponent of this site. He went to great lengths to show that Lindsay was a legitimate site. And now another person did their dissertation on it, a woman named Catherine Krasinski. And so what she did in her dissertation, she's now a professor at Adelphi University in New York, what she did was look at all the bones from 10 or so sites that were really controversial. Lindsay Mammoth was one of them. Bluefish Caves in the Yukon was another one, if you've ever heard of that site. Of those 8 or 9 sites that she looked at for her dissertation, only the Lindsay Mammoth did she look at. She looked at 346 cut marks on all the Lindsay Mammoth bones, and she found 10 of those, 346, looked likely to be caused by human. There were also long bones that looked like they were smashed with big boulders to get the marrow. Remember, hunter-gatherer peoples and people from Norway to this day really like marrow as a fatty substance to be mixed with meat and berries for pemmican, jerky-like things. Just a great protein source and fat source for hunter-gatherers who really need that sort of thing. Based on that, she said, of those 346 marks on the bones that she found, 10 of them had a 50% chance of being caused by humans. No stone tools. Now that is the real death knell for any really old site in the Americas these days. If you don't have any stone tools that show that people were there who made the stone tools, use those stone tools to either kill and or butcher that animal, you might as well not even consider it a legitimate site. I'm not sure that that's necessarily how we should interpret it, though, because when you think about the first peoples coming into a landscape, they probably wouldn't have known where the stone sources were. They hadn't figured that out yet. They had a little landscape learning to do. They're going to be killing animals with other things like bone. Remember the Manus mastodon in Washington, killed with a bone projectile point. It's very obvious that Native Americans, the first Americans, even the ones at Clovis, were using very sophisticated bone, ivory, antler technologies, were killing animals with those just as well as with stone tools. So I don't necessarily agree with the scenario that all these really old sites have to have stone tools. But the ones that all the archaeologists agree are very old have at least a few stone tools at them, even if it's just maybe 10 flakes that show that people were there and then used them to butcher the animal. There's a couple sites in Wisconsin that I talk about, the Schaefer and Hebior sites, almost exactly the same radiocarbon dates as the Lindsay Mammoth, about 12,000 years ago or so, just right around there in Wisconsin. Similar Columbian mammoths up in Wisconsin, right next to the ice fronts. They have maybe 10 or 15 stone tools, and everybody believes that those are legitimate human-caused kills. And that's all it takes. Lindsay does not have that. What it has is some cut marks that may or probably are made by humans, but then a lot of other marks on those bones that clearly were not. And so that's why the Lindsay Mammoth is controversial. That's how I present it in the book. I'm not sure about it. I think maybe we need to do a little more work at that site. I know Les Davis was a huge proponent of it as the key archaeologist on that project. I know Catherine Krasinski did her dissertation research on it. She is confident that that animal was butchered by people. But if you really look at the raw data of what she presented, it's kind of questionable. And I would love to have stone tools. Even though I just said you don't have to have stone tools, boy, I really wish they'd found some stone tools at that site. So for that reason, I'm not sure you can really say that that's the oldest site in Montana. It is a controversial site. But if you are one of those people that accept it, which way did people migrate to Montana? Pacific Coast. Because the ice-free corridor probably wasn't open at that time. But if you accept this site, which all archaeologists these days accept as Montana's oldest, best site, and this, it's 7 o'clock. So this is up by Wilsaw, Montana. This is a site that was found in the late 1960s, right around the same time as Lindsay Mammoth was found. There were 2 guys that were excavating on the Anzac property to get gravel to put in the high school there, at the parking lot at the high school. And they found human bones fell out. About 100 stone and bone artifacts fell out. You've all seen a lot of these probably at the Historical Society Museum here in town when it was open. They were all on display. So 100 or so bone and stone, beautiful Clovis artifacts, clearly of the Clovis ancestry, the radiocarbon dates showed that these dated to about 11,000 years ago, right when Clovis was around in Montana. Clearly the oldest site. The DNA study that I mentioned earlier shows that Asian ancestry and then ancestral to then all North and Native American tribes. If you accept that the Anzac site is the oldest site in Montana, how did people get to Montana? How did they migrate? We know they came from Asia. Which way? Pacific coast or interior?
But not necessarily.
I don't know either, right? You can't decide. They could have come down the Pacific coast, come up the Columbia River into Montana, just as likely, since the ice-free corridor was open after 12,000 years ago. They could have come down there through the ice-free corridor. And I would say, when I give this argument to my students at the University of Montana, most of them think logically about it, and they think, well, Montana hunter-gatherers were inland adapted. Those people coming down from Alaska through the ice-free corridor, makes sense that they would have been inland adapted as well, and therefore probably used the ice-free corridor to come down. Does that Blackfeet story maybe point to the ice-free corridor? And then maybe the Salish story point to the Pacific coast? Maybe, and I think in all likelihood it was probably both directions. Which one was first though? I don't know. I'd have to have a time travel machine. That's definitely one of the first things I would do once that's invented. I want to go back and see what that is. Now, the Anzac site keeps enlightening us. There was a new paper published just a few weeks ago by Jim Chatters and a couple of his colleagues. They had studied the stable isotope data from the human bones that were found at the Anzac site. This was research that was already done. They collaborated with tribes on it. The end result of their research was that the people that lived at Anzac ate a lot of mammoths. And they also ate a little bit of bison, a little bit of camel, and a little bit of horse. And now I wish I could say that this information was in my book, but remember, I started this book and wrote most of it 3 years ago, and that's how long it takes to come out. So this is brand new research, but just also telling you, once you start digging into the data of a lot of these sites, you can get some really cool information. And so that tells us, so there's been a big controversy in archaeology about what Clovis culture, like people that lived at Anzac and Wilson, Montana, was all about. And a lot of people say, well, they're like most hunter-gatherers, and they hunted and gathered a lot of different animals and a lot of different plants, and I think that's probably true, but if you look at the stable isotope data that Jim Chatters and his group collected, boy, it looks like at this particular site, they were eating a lot of elephant meat. Oh, yeah, that looked like the big focus at this site. And I'm going to show you a few slides about other key Clovis sites in the region that have been found in Wyoming and southern Alberta and these areas, and they all indicate a lot of big animal hunting. So it's what, I didn't have this data from Chatter's article, but that's kind of how I wrote it in the Land of Beginnings book anyway, because just based on the archaeological site data we already had, that's what the information was kind of telling us. So the Colby Mammoth, this is a site over by Worland, Wyoming, in the Bighorn Basin there. There's a museum there in Worland. I'm forgetting the name of it, but you won't miss it if you go to Worland. They have a wonderful display about the Colby Mammoth site. And that dates to about 10,800 years ago, so right around the time of Anzac. They had killed 7 mammoths, that's misspelled obviously, as well as a horse and a camel. That was a famous site excavated by George Frisson, who was a University of Wyoming professor for years and years, and was one of the reasons I got into Great Plains archaeology. It was George Frisson. The Wally's Beach site, this is either the oldest Clovis site or the oldest just before Clovis site that there is. People at the Wally's Beach site in Alberta killed several horses and camels at about 11,400 years old, and this is just north of the Montana border. And this is kind of a new one. The University of Wyoming is working on the Laprelle mammoth down in Douglas, Wyoming. This is a butchered Columbian mammoth that dates to about the same time as Anzac, down south of Anzac in the state of Wyoming. And they found not just the butchered Columbian mammoth, but evidence of a huge industry involving production of clothing and use of lots of needles made from all kinds of small mammals, like jackrabbit, red fox, feline, and that's all they could say, that it was a cat. So it could be any kind of cat like bobcat, lynx, cougar, or even an American cheetah that lived at that time. And so, yeah, they wore clothes. That's pretty cool. You know, I'm pretty sure we all knew that. But this site, they've actually found the needles at this Laprelle Mammoth site, so really amazing stuff. And I guess the reason I'm talking about all those sites after we talked about Anzac, and especially the new data from the Anzac site that Chatter's found, showing a lot of elephant eating, is that all these other sites that are big Clovis sites from the same time period are also showing elephant killing, horse hunting, and camel hunting, as well as some bison. So big mammals look like the target of these first peoples of Montana. So which route did they take to Montana? We know that that ancestry started more than 12,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, and took them from Northeast Asia through Beringia. Which route they took depends on which site you accept as the oldest in Montana. It is very controversial. Again, if you haven't been paying attention, if you accept the Lindsay Mammoth, which is totally fine, I'm not going to be critical of you if you do. I kind of think maybe it's a real site. I'm not sure. But if you accept Catherine Kaczynski's analysis of the Lindsay Mammoth, then you should think that the first Montanans came from down the Pacific coast and then into the interior. If, though, you accept the Anzac site as the oldest site, they could have come from both directions. Now, it doesn't mean that the people that settled maybe at Lindsay came from the Pacific coast, and then the people came down the Estuary Corridor. I think both routes were probably used. I still can't tell you which one was used first. If you're looking to read the book, like I said, and come away with a conclusion about that, I say very plainly that I don't have the answer to that question, even though it's the most important one. So for now, the Anzac site is vital. It links Asians with Native Americans. It links that Clovis culture with all other Native American peoples, north and south. And it also tells us that those first Montanans really like to kill big animals. So where to look for early sites? You know, I think this is the same thing that any archaeologist would have told you for the last 50 years, but large rivers, high terraces, not obviously the floodplains of current river corridors, but the higher terraces which would have flowed with higher water back in the late Pleistocene, 11, 12,000 years ago. So not necessarily going to be right on the banks of where the rivers are today. It could be significantly further up on higher terraces where those higher river levels were 12,000 years ago. Same is true for lakes. Where I work in Yellowstone, you can see the old lake terraces of Yellowstone Lake, and we've found old lake terraces that date to 10,000 years ago, more than a half mile in the interior, half mile from the current modern shoreline. And so we definitely don't want to be just looking along the edges of modern riverways, but those higher terraces of rivers and lakes that are associated with those places. And so if you're out there on your ranches and looking for places and looking for these old sites, those are the places that I would look. And that is it. And I know you probably have a ton of questions, so we'll just save the rest of this for questions.
Thank you so much, Doug. We do have plenty of time for questions, so wave your hand around, I'll come run the mic to you. Or he did a great job and we can go home.
In my casual reading, it seems to me that there are sites in South America that are older than the sites here. How would you integrate those findings with?
Yeah, so I mean the big site down in South America is Monteverde, and that's in Chile, and I would say that was the first site to break that Clovis first barrier. That was 30 years ago now, where people realized, okay, we actually do have sites older than 11,000 years old, and that's all the way down on the southern Pacific coast of Chile, and that dates to 12,500 years ago. So I think all it does in terms of our talk is point us to the Pacific coast as the migration corridor.
Possible there was reverse migration up, settlement earlier there, and then migration back up.
I've never heard anybody propose that, except you right now. No, I mean, it's just, we know for a fact that there were connections between South American populations and like Easter Island people, Rapa Nui, people living in Easter Island, but that was only 2,000 years ago. There's no evidence of for example, a Pacific coast migration earlier than 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. That was the last place on Earth. What an amazing journey, by the way, that Pacific Polynesian migration in canoes trying to find Easter Island. Can you imagine? But that's significantly younger. The only other way they could have done it would have been around Antarctica, and nobody's ever done archaeology. So I don't know how they would get there. You know what I mean?
Is there any ground left at either Anzac or Lindsay that would be prospective for further excavation?
There's a lot of ground around Anzac. You know, that particular landscape was a side of a hill, and most of that's been removed, but it's actually pretty interesting. They found other human remains from other ages in that vicinity, but it's private properties, so people that do it would have to permit access. It would be worth prospecting for sure. I don't know about the Lindsay Mammoth, but that would be a good place to look if there was still, or looking for similar landscapes as to where the Lindsay is.
What about the other DNA with the other tribes in Montana? Do they all show an Asian DNA?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, there was just a really cool study done of the Blackfeet and modern DNA and some ancient remains, older remains that the Blackfeet supported in terms of trying to find ancestry, and that also pointed very clearly to an Asian. Yeah, and there's not very many skeletons of that time period. Anzac is very unique in that regard, but there's 8 or 9 sets of human remains that date to that time period in like California, Idaho, down into Mexico, from that 11,000 to 12,000 year old time range, and they all point to Asia. But you know, we haven't found any human remains of that age on the East Coast, so no. So that might change everything if you know, maybe Dennis Stanford will be proved correct, right, Mark?
We live near. Ready? We live near the McAfee site out by Montana City. So I went over and examined it, and I can't figure out how many times that's been used. There's a layer of soil on normal, then a layer of charcoal, then a layer of soil, then another layer of charcoal. They must have been using that same site over and over, but a lot of times went by between the use of it. What is
it's just the circumstances of daily travel by hunter-gatherer peoples, right? And so Patrick Rennie just published a book about the McAfee site, and I originally had wanted to include a chapter, like an after Clovis chapter to this book, but for reasons that just are beyond this discussion, we just decided not to, because it's mostly because it's covered in the Montana Before History book. But anyway, the McAfee sites dates to maybe 10,500 years ago. It's just after Anzac. But you start to see more and more archaeological sites like McAfee, which is near here, and Indian Creek, which is south of Helena as well. Both of those sites are kind of just after Anzac. But you do start to see more and more sites after that point, and start to see Native American populations grow. And then they were using those landscapes over and over. It just depended on where their hunting and gathering was taking them. So one year they'd be there and they'd think it'd be a good place to be, and then another year they wouldn't. So.
Layer of dirt covered up the charcoal again and again.
Yep. Yeah, just creeks. Yep. That's archaeologists love sites like that. Yep, for sure.
I found a Folsom Point there, I think, 2 years.
Yep, that's a Folsom site. Yep.
Was the Anzac child reburied to the Salish people?
The Anzac site was reburied by a group. So the Anzac's private property. Those human remains, while controversial in this interpretation, were not subject to NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that was passed in 1990. Because it was found, those are really just for human remains found on federal land or in federal museums. Since the Anzac site was private property. It wasn't subject to that. Regardless of that, Sarah Anzac and the Anzac family got together with Eski Willerslev and the DNA scientists and with Native American groups, and they have since reburied those remains near where they originally came from, and none of us know where the reburial location is, but they were reburied. Yeah.
I've got a question, Doug. What can the archaeology tell us about the methods for killing a mammoth? Like, that's a 3 to 5 ton animal.
Yeah, so I think for years what it looked like was that it was in the Clovis toolkit, the stone projectile points produced during that Clovis time period by the people that lived at Anzac are probably the most beautiful and sophisticated styles of stone projectile points produced anywhere. They're very large compared to what were used after once. So mammoths and those animals, as you know, don't live in Montana anymore. They went extinct about this time. That's a whole other topic that we could get into, but don't have time. But those animals went extinct, perhaps partly due to human predation, but not completely. And so the toolkit they devised to kill those animals was very sophisticated. And so I think most of us think that it was multiple spears in the animal, following the animal, keeping attacking it until it falls. Now, somebody had just done a really cool study thinking that, I forget what this is called, but do you remember in the Braveheart movie where they had the spears on the ground, and when the group came running up at them, they lifted them up and what's that? I forget. I'm not a Braveheart researcher. Anyway, there's an interpretation now, just in the last year, that Clovis spear points were used similarly, that they weren't thrown with the outlet all the time, although probably were a lot, but that in some circumstances they were chasing them and either having them in the ground and animals running into them, or people actually, So we're not exactly sure. It's probably some combination of that.
Other questions? Yeah, Kirby.
So approximately how many people are we talking about when you talk about like the group that was with the Anzac family? Approximately what size of group is that?
That group that was at Anzac, you can look at the 100 stone and bone tools that were found there. They look like they came from 4, 5, 6 different quarries, probably produced by a few different individuals. The people that put those in either came from one close-knit nuclear family, but probably more than likely it was a band, meaning a group of closely related families that were all living in that area 11,000 years ago. So had to have been a mating or breeding size population for all those subsequent generations to come. So, just in central Montana there, maybe 100, 200 people, all hanging out together, stretching the anthropological wisdom even a little more. Almost certainly was probably exogamy, and one of the hallmark characteristics of Clovis technology is that there's a lot of wide-ranging use of exotic stones from wide-ranging 300, 400, 500-mile distances away from where the sites are. And that most anthropologists interpret that to be people going out and finding mates and trying to reduce inbreeding through exogamy and always marrying outside of your local group. So, trade. And trade, of course, yeah. I prefer the mating scenario.
Is there a question over here?
Yeah. So, does the bone? Is there a defined technologies for making bone tools, and are they specific to Clovis? People made certain kinds of bone tools, and other people?
Absolutely. So the Clovis toolkit has some very unique types of bone artifacts. They're long cylindrical artifacts. There's some pictures in the Land of Beginnings book. I think Montana Before History has a few as well. And those are probably for the foreshaft pieces that attached to the Clovis points themselves, or they were hunting implements themselves. So I think they were probably used as foreshafts attached with a long dart, and then mostly used as the atlatl, the spear thrower. You know, you guys have dogs, the dog, what do they call that? The chucker. That's atlatl technology stolen straight out of Clovis. So they were using the atlatls or spear throwers, except if they were, you know.
Question. The Old North Trail, is that post or pre-Clovis?
I have no idea, but that probably, you know, if we know people used the ice-free corridor, whether it was the first people or not. So I don't want people to think that the ice-free corridor wasn't used. We know for sure that it was. We just don't know when it was first used. In fact, we know people went south from places like Montana, north up into Alaska, because the fluted points like Clovis occur up there, but they're several hundred years later. So we know that people were actually, you know, migrating back and forth through that corridor. And that probably is part of that Old North Trail, yeah. I'm just speculating, but yeah.
You mentioned a 2004 study that was able to identify the foods that the mother of the Anzac child had consumed. Can you explain how they would do that? I don't think there were funereal remains of the mother there. There was just the boy.
I know, it's very complicated, and I'm not sure I understand it either, but it apparently is related to this analysis of the stable isotopes in the bone. And somehow, I can't do this, but apparently Jim Chatters was able to do this. He's a smarter person than me, was able to link that with the diet of the mother based on what the infant's bones. Believe me, I'm a little, I'll have to learn a little more about it. It just literally just came out like 2 weeks ago, so I have to do a little research myself on that.
Well, DNA of the child would be maternal, mitochondrial DNA from the child would be maternal. So maybe they worked with that.
Yeah. It looks like you know more about it than I do. I just thought it was a cool study. It had to do with Anzac, and it kind of proved my theory about mammoth killing. But I think that article is going to be a little controversial because based on other people I've talked to, it looks like they took some stretches of interpretation, you know.
Yeah, okay. They haven't found any evidence of like a buffalo jump type of kill in these early days.
No, there definitely were running animals and ambushing them because, you know, remember the Colby Mammoth site has seven mammoths, but that was the edge of a little pond, and so they were ambushing the animals at those spots. It doesn't look like they were the first evidence of those big buffalo jumps like we know and love here in Montana. Probably wasn't until what's called like the Middle Archaic period, maybe 5,000 years ago or so, the running of those big herds. Yeah.
What's the oldest date you found on Yellowstone Lake? And any human remains found there ever?
Yeah, no, okay, so there's two questions. The first is we have found 2 Clovis points in Yellowstone. Both our teams from the University of Montana, go Grizz. One was down at the southern shore of Yellowstone Lake, and it was an obsidian Clovis point produced from Teton Pass obsidian, which is from down near Jackson Hole. There's an obsidian source down there. And then we found another Clovis point up by Gardner, not too far away from here, but and that was red porcelainite, and that was from eastern Montana. And so those are the oldest artifacts we've ever found in Yellowstone, and that anybody has found actually. But I have never found human remains in Yellowstone. But there have been 2 sets of human remains found, both at Yellowstone Lake around Fishing Bridge, and they dated to about 2,000 years ago or so. They didn't date to the Clovis time.
So what would have happened to all these bodies?
It's a really good question. You know, in Yellowstone it makes sense because the soils are so acidic, we hardly ever find bone at all of anything because the bone just withers away in the dirt. Might have been a lot of platform burials too, exposed to the elements and that sort of thing, but yeah. I don't want to find them. I really don't. I know a lot of archaeologists want to find human remains because you can learn so much from them, but I think leave it where it is. Yeah.
Is doing archaeological digs in the national parks, is that pretty unique? Or are you allowed to do the same?
You would be arrested if you just went down and did. Yeah, no, you need a permit. I have to apply for research permits every year. This was our 18th summer last year. We'll be going back for our 19th summer in Yellowstone, but it all has to do with our connections. Ann Johnson and Elaine Hale were the archaeologists at the time that I started at the University of Montana 18 years ago, and they both went to the University of Montana. So when I approached them about working there, they said, hell yeah, let's do it. And so we've been going back now for 18 years, and it's been a wonderful relationship, and it's been great for our students. A lot of our students get jobs, believe it or not. Laura is a good example. Has a master's degree from the University of Montana, and she works at the Historical Society. You still work for? No. That's what I thought. Okay, she works for the Montana Department of Transportation. Montana Department of Transportation used to work for the State Historic Preservation Office here. There's too many jobs for archaeologists. We can't fill a lot of them. So if you have, I mean, it's amazing, but there just is there's a lot of work out there, especially if you're willing to move around. What was your original question? I was trying to promote University of Montana, and yeah. I want you to know that there is a future for your child if they decide to be an archaeologist.
I was just curious about how different doing archaeology in the national parks.
It is very unique. We're the only group other than University of Wyoming has a group that's been going in lately, and they were also one of the original groups that were in there quite a bit back in the day. And now the Salish Kootenai College has a tribal archaeological field school that goes in every summer as well. So that's it, just us three at this point, I think.
Hi. So I'm here with pretty limited knowledge on archaeology, but what your lecture made me wonder is, how do archaeologists know that both routes couldn't have been used at the same time?
They absolutely could have been, but we know that the geology of that ice-free corridor, based on dead animals that have been found in the ice-free corridor and based on just dating of the geological formations in the ice-free corridor, it doesn't look like that was open until after 12,000 years. So people wouldn't have been coming down that way. But after that, they definitely did, and we know that they did, yeah. Are you saying there's no controversy? I'm trying to make it interesting.
I wonder, with stuff coming out of ice patches, is there any likelihood that some of those objects might date to pre-Clovis, or is that kind of not possible because of the way where people would have needed to live to survive and stuff?
So there's a ton of archaeology these days at the melting of glaciers and ice patch edges because of global warming, and just these ice patches and snow patches are melting away. And Native Americans for thousands and thousands of years, as well as Norwegians and northern Siberians, any northern cultures were going up to these ice patches in the summer to hunt. All over the world, these ice patches are being exposed, not just in Montana, but tons of these places. It's become a whole genre of archaeology, and Craig Lee at Montana State University has been a real proponent of looking at ice patches to find artifacts where Native Americans were hunting, because for thousands of years they were covered by ice. Now they're melting away. They're finding sandals and pottery and all kinds of cool stuff on the edges of these ice patches where people would go in the summer just because it's cool, and animals also like to be there, so they'd hunt them there. The oldest artifact ever found in an ice patch was found by Craig Lee right near Yellowstone. It dates to about 9,300 years ago, so it's pretty old. But nobody's ever found 11,000-year-old artifacts at an ice patch yet.
We have time
They
for
certainly could.
one more question. Anybody? Last question? Last question, best question? All righty. One brave soul.
I'm such a skeptical. What if you throw the ice-free corridor time out and take back 2,000-3,000 years?
So you're saying if the ice-free corridor was open earlier,
Yeah.
then those first people could have come down earlier, for sure. Because there are, I didn't talk about sites in Alaska, but they're, older than 12,000 years old, and but there needs to be a lot more archaeology up there too, to be honest.
When 30 years ago, I was doing that kind of work in Alaska, and there was a theory, and I'm just wondering where that's gone, that there was a wave that came over, there was a wave that came over that then was closed off, then a second wave came over, so they pushed the Athabascans in, and then became the Eskimos. So, and then the Athabascan language and genes came all the way down. So how does that, is that gone away, or does that fit in, or?
No, I mean, it's just later in time. So the Athabascan and especially the Eskimo migration was much more recent, within the last few thousand years. So the earliest Paleo-Indian migrations up in Alaska, in what was called Beringia, that linked Siberia with Alaska, we're talking 15,000 people probably got there, and they were hanging out. And then once the ice-free corridor opened up, once the glaciers started to melt back from the Pacific coast, then they just came down at that point. But the Alaskan Eskimo Aleut migration across the Arctic, we still know that's an important migration, but it was much more recent. Yep.
Thank you so much.